This is the top of my 2004 F-150 Super Cab. As you can see, the clear coat is failing really badly. Even though I've tried to keep it waxed consistently over the years, it's been outside ever since I got it, so the weather has taken its toll. So after doing a lot of research and watching a lot of different YouTube videos, I decided I could probably redo the clear coat myself. The first step in redoing any vehicle's clear coat is you have to wet sand off the old clear coat. So I bought a variety of wet sanding paper and sponges ranging from 400 grit all the way up to 3000 grit. I will say in retrospect that after using both the sponges and the paper, I felt like the sanding sponges were a little bit easier to work with, and if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably just use those and not the paper. Despite all the research I had done before beginning this project, I forgot that you shouldn't finish wet sanding with finer than 400 or maybe 600 grit sandpaper when removing the clear coat. If you use anything finer than that, then when you go to apply the primer later, it won't be able to adhere to the surface. Unfortunately, I started with the 400 grit sandpaper and worked my way all the way up through the 3000 grit, not realizing till much later how much trouble that could cause. This is what it looked like after several hours of wet sanding. The next step was removing all of the residue and double-sided tape left over from the windshield trim that runs up and over the truck. I detailed that process in another video that I have on my channel if you're interested in watching that. I also had to scrape off some old RTV gasket maker and pieces of the old gasket from the cargo light. My garage served as my makeshift paint booth for this project. It didn't give me much room to work on the roof of the truck, but it allowed me to minimize the amount of contaminants that got into the paint. Before you can spray any primer or paint, you obviously have to mask off the area to be painted as well as prep the surface. I purchased a variety of painter's tape, masking paper, and drop cloths, as well as tack cloths. It took me almost 2 hours to carefully mask everything off using a combination of the tape, then applying the masking paper, and then the drop cloths. At this point, my main concern was keeping the overspray from the primer, paint, and clear coat off of the rest of the truck. I didn't realize until later how much overspray would end up sticking to the garage walls and floor, not to mention my tools, the garage door, and everything else you can think of in a garage. I applied the tape sticky side out on the inside of the cargo light hole. Here's how it looked after getting everything masked off and ready. I did end up taping a drop cloth to the wall closest to the truck, but that didn't turn out to be all that helpful. Before you apply the primer, you need to clean the surface. I used a solution of isopropyl alcohol and distilled water. Then you wipe the surface down with a tack cloth. You'll definitely want to wear a respirator and some goggles. I purchased the primer and paint from automotivetouchup.com. I used their red primer, and my paint code is E4, which is vermilion red. For the clear coat spray, I went with ERA brand 2K High Gloss. I applied both cans of the red primer, which ended up being 2 full coats. I used a spray paint can handle for part of the process, but ultimately decided it didn't work all that well. This is what the primer coat looked like after it dried. You can see it's not sticking and basically just wipes right off. At this point, I didn't realize I had used too fine of sandpaper during the wet sanding process, so I thought maybe I had applied the primer incorrectly or had used too much. Unfortunately, at this point, I decided to wipe off the excess primer and proceed with applying the paint. That did not turn out well. I went ahead and applied all 3 cans of the E4 base coat color. For the record, each can of red primer costs about $15, and each can of the base coat paint costs about $30, meaning I now have about $120 worth of paint on the truck. After applying the last coat of paint, you're supposed to apply the Clearcoat spray within a few hours. I had a bad feeling this wasn't looking like it was supposed to, so thankfully I didn't apply the Clearcoat. I went ahead and unwrapped the truck, knowing that something had gone wrong but not sure exactly what. I called the automotive touch-up company and did a bunch of research, eventually figuring out that I had used the wrong grit sandpaper before applying the primer. At this point, the paint was coming off with just 3000 grit sandpaper, so I knew it couldn't be saved. I started to remove the paint in the driveway, but realized what a mess it was going to be. What I didn't get a video of is me at the coin-operated car wash spending about an hour and a bunch of quarters removing $120 worth of primer and paint. At least I now knew to use nothing finer than 400 grit sandpaper. Since I was now going to have to repeat all of my previous steps, I figured I should try to contain the paint overspray a little better. I bought several 9x12 tarps and hung them in the garage to try to keep everything from getting covered with primer and paint. I also put a tarp and a drop cloth on the floor under the truck. Of course, then I had to mask the truck off again. I tried to attach the drop cloths to the tarps as much as I could to provide better protection for the truck and for the garage itself. I went ahead and wiped the truck down again with the isopropyl alcohol mixture as well as the tack cloth. Here's what the top of the truck looked like before my second attempt at applying the primer. I also wondered if part of the issue on my first attempt was the brand of primer that I used, so I decided to try a different brand for my second attempt. I went with a Rust-Oleum automotive primer in a flat red color. I applied 2 coats of the Rust-Oleum primer. The color was obviously different than the bright red primer I used the first time, but similarly, it just didn't seem to be adhering the way I thought primer should. The way that I set up the tarps and the drop cloths definitely caught a lot of the overspray and kept it from coating everything in the garage like before. Even though the primer seemed to have an unusual texture, I figured I just needed to allow it to dry longer, knowing that this time I had done my surface prep correctly. It didn't take long to figure out that this second primer attempt had failed as well. I knew better than to apply my base coat paint. I unmasked the truck and spent another hour dry and wet sanding off the Rust-Oleum primer. After doing even more research and making another customer service call, this time to Rust-Oleum, I learned that this particular primer was only meant to be applied over bare metal surfaces and not previously painted ones. My third time masking off the truck went much faster since I had lots of practice. Here's the top after surface prep before applying my third and hopefully last brand of primer. Speaking of which, this time I went with a gray colored filler primer from Seymour Paints, and I bought vermilion red paint from R&E Paint Supply on Amazon. Just to be safe, I called both companies to talk through my prep and paint processes before applying any product. I applied 2 coats of primer and 3 coats of the base coat color. This time my primer seemed to dry and stick like it should, and my base coat color looked good. I figured I was ready to apply the 2K Clearcoat. I followed the instructions to activate the two-part clear coat. I applied 4 total coats of the clear coat, doing my best to make each coat even and consistent. I changed the filters on my respirator multiple times throughout the process. Before I started, I had considered not using a respirator, but after seeing the filters, I was definitely glad I'd used it. This was how the top of the truck turned out after letting the clear coat cure for about 4 days. I felt like the base coat color was a good match to the rest of the truck, and the clear coat looked even. The orange peel was pretty bad, but no worse than I was expecting. After the clear coat has completely cured, you'll need to wet sand and polish the surface to remove the orange peel and any other imperfections. I used a variety of very fine sandpaper, Menzerna brand paint polishes, and polishing pads in different levels of abrasiveness. I already owned a corded random orbital polisher, and I bought a cordless one to use as well. The next step in the process is to wet sand the clear coat. From what I had read, it's best to start with 1,000 grit, then move up to 2,000 and finish with 3,000, so that's exactly what I did. Here's how it looked after finishing with the 3,000 grit. Now it's time to polish. I know there's a number of good polishing products out there, but I've used Menzerna brand polishes before, and I always felt like they worked well and were easy to use. I polished 1/4 of the top, beginning with the heavy cut 1,000, then going up to the medium 2,000, and ending with the final polish 3,000. Here's how it looked after finishing the final polish. I felt like the orange peel was mostly gone, but the surface was still very hazy, and I definitely didn't want to leave it looking like this after all the work I'd put into it. I read that sometimes 3,000 grit wet sanding isn't fine enough before doing your heavy cut polish, and you might need to go as fine as 7,000 grit. I went back and wet sanded the top with 5,000 then 7,000 grit paper. This is after wet sanding the entire top with the 5 and 7,000 grit. It's hard to see, but the scratches are definitely less pronounced than after the 3,000 grit wet sanding. I went ahead and used the heavy and medium Menzerna polishes again, but only on the one corner to make sure it was going to turn out okay. Keep in mind you can only wet sand and polish so many times before you start to remove too much clear coat material. This is how it turned out after one pass with the heavy cut 1,000 polish. And this is after one pass with the medium cut 2,000 polish. Since it seemed like the test corner I had been working on was turning out okay, I figured I was safe to go ahead and polish the rest of the surface. I used all 3 levels of the Menzerna polish across the other 3 corners. Here's how the top of the truck turned out after all the polishing was finished and I had applied some Adams ceramic coating. As part of the project, I also removed and repainted the windshield trim and replaced the cargo light. Time will tell how well the new paint and clear coat hold up to the elements, but I'm very pleased with how it turned out. I plan to do the hood of the truck next since it's almost as bad as the top of the truck used to be. Here's a quick recap of the primers, paints, and clear coat that I used. I spent about $260 total on everything you see here, plus another $200 or so on tape, sandpaper, tarps and drop cloths, a respirator, and a few other supplies. Let me know what you thought of this video and stay tuned as I slowly add more videos to my channel.